Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to week 12, where we're going to talk about the Great War. By the end of this, I hope that you will see that the axiom that history doesn't repeat itself, but it likes to rhyme, although misattributed to uh, Mark Twain, is not insufficient to explain not only the First World War, but also today's current environment. I would also like to state at the very beginning that this will not end happily. There is a victory at the end of sorts, maybe a couple of victories at the end. But is it really a victory, or is it just a hollow cessation of hostilities? And we're going to talk about the Great War and the world that it leaves behind. Before we get too far into it, I do want to go into a couple of terms. We have 2 pages of terms, so please do take notes of these. First off, we have militarism. Militarism is this idea of glorifying military service, military might, the strength of a nation based upon its arms and how much it can inflict harm upon other societies. So essentially, the military becomes kind of the final expression of nationalism, not certain amounts of culture, not certain amounts of art, not certain amounts of wealth, but rather the ability to inflict damage upon another group of people merely because they live in a different geographic area. Beyond that, we have total war. Of course, as we're building up militaries, as we're building up massively mechanized war machines, whether it be machine guns or submarines or flying machines like dirigibles and balloons, zeppelins, those sort of things, but also heavier than aircraft like biplanes and triplanes. Eventually, the war begins to take on a very fluid front in a way that hadn't been seen since the medieval period. The totality of war is all-encompassing. Not only does it affect the place where the bombs are falling, but also where the bombs are made, the food that feeds the soldiers, the food that feeds the civilians, the infrastructure that makes the war possible. All of it is bent towards the creation of military might, of continuing the military effort, and of leveraging all the resources that a country has in order to win a war. So this includes combatants and non-combatants alike. And during the Great War, during World War I, non-combatants increasingly are targeted. Again, I reckon harken back rather to the medieval period, where when cities are besieged, civilians were often auxiliary casualties or unintended side effects, collateral damage, to use the 20th century term. We're also going to talk about the Bolsheviks as a revolutionary communist organization, not the only communist organization that's springing up in Russia and elsewhere, but they are the most successful one, and they are able to kick off a secondary revolution in Russia that supplants the nationalist, more representative republic kind of constitutional monarchy, pseudo-constitutional monarchy of Russia, and institute a communist totalitarian regime. Now, this is not to be confused with a communist political regime. This is a totalitarian regime, absolutely. It is based on the economic theory of communism, but politically speaking, it is only interested in maintaining its power and maintaining its control over its populace. The Treaty of Versailles technically ends hostilities between all belligerent parties, although in reality it was more of a hostage situation, really, because both sides in Europe, both the Allied powers and the Central powers, were exhausted from these years of total war, and the economies were on the brink of collapse. And were the United States not to have entered, it might have ended much differently. But the United States did enter indeed. It did bolster the Allies, and thus we have the Treaty of Versailles. It essentially assigns blame to Germany for being the causer of the war. That point is very, very debatable and hotly contested in historian circles, although majority of people do fall on the side of Germany didn't do it by itself, myself included. And of course, everything old is new again. We're also going to talk about the Spanish flu, which was an amazingly, incredibly infectious spread of disease throughout the globe, arguably one of the most virulent and rapacious viral infections in the modern era. It comes immediately at the end of the First World War. It gets its name Spanish flu. We'll talk about that in a little bit further on down the road because of the first really celebrity case that was uh, reported in medical journals. But the upshot is it rampages through the globe over the course of about 2 years, from 1918 to the early 1920, and it targets a typical group of populations. And it also surprisingly targeted and killed people who should not have been quite so susceptible to H1N1. Now, if H1N1 sounds familiar to you, you may remember 2009. There was a swine flu outbreak. It was almost a pandemic. Luckily, the apparatus was in place to handle this kind of infection. There was a global response that kept the numbers relatively sustainable. Yes, it was deadly. It did kill more people than currently coronavirus has, but the curve was very much flattened. There were a lot of cases spread out over a longer period of time, which allowed the hospitals and medical officials to really tackle it. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in 1918. Things like the systemic medical systems, governmental responses, you'll see as we get on to that. And then finally, we're going to talk about the lost generation. We often talk about wars, we talk about events in a very abstract kind of way. We don't talk about the impact that it has on most people. Even when we talk about things like the strikes by skilled workers against the new machinery, the so-called Luddite movement, we don't really get to look at how the outcome affects the individual person other than in broad general terms. Instead, this time we're going to look at the lost generation, and this may strike a chord for those of you who have military service members in your family or who are themselves military service members. So I do want to warn you ahead of time. There may be some trigger images and some trigger phraseology that's going to be used. Unfortunately, it is incredibly necessary as we are historians in this class, even though it be just a introductory freshman one. So we must be familiar with the ugly side of human interactions as well as the more abstract ones. So let's do a little bit of review before we go too much further so that we are all on the same page. What term was used to describe the way in which Europeans kept peace on the continent between the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the beginning of the Great War? If you were saying the balance of powers, that's correct. Essentially, the policy was my army, my country's army, is strong enough to defeat any one opponent. So France was strong enough to, say, defeat Germany or to at least stop them. They were equal. And then Germany, by their own part, was like, we're strong enough to stop France, for example. Or Russia was like, we're strong enough to stop Austria-Hungary. And Austria-Hungary is like, oh, we're strong enough to stop Russia, that sort of thing. So what term was used to describe the acquisition of land that belongs to other people? If you said colonialism, that's correct. It's also if you said imperialism, yes, we'll accept that as well. So colonialism is the acquisition of land. Now, why did we have European countries trying to acquire more and more land? Well, part of it was the need for resources, much like we saw in the India case, the need for growing poppies to sell to China as opium, the need to grow tea to sell to England as tea, uh, also as a kind of market for those economies that were chugging along. We noticed when we were talking about India in the middle of the 19th century, 40% of the textiles that were exported from England wound up being sold to India. So that's a big, big market. Also, finally, prestige. There's a certain level of prestige, having more territory than anybody else, as if they had forgotten the lessons of the Napoleonic War, of Napoleon's grandiose designs were so much anathema to a free nation and to the sovereignty of each nation. But if we're taking over other people's land, then that's okay. So, what was one of the ways that European powers used to keep native populations in line? If you said using the military, using concentration camps, dividing and ruling, you would all be correct. Dividing and ruling is setting the population against each other, whether it be racial divides like the Belgians do in Rwanda with the Hutsi and the I'm sorry, the um, Tutsi and the Hutu, setting each other at each other's throats, whether it's England in India setting the Muslims and the Hindus at each other's throats, or whether it's in at home setting one ethnic population against another. A good example of that is racial um, discrimination, kind of a Jim Crow acts in the United States, setting poor white people against black people, that sort of thing. Keeps people distracted. Oh, we can't have those people moving into this neighborhood. That person can't be in our social circle because nebulous reason, insert here. And it's all just to keep the powerful in power. Honestly, that's the only reason. And the military was also used to put down riots. The military was also used to put down rebellions. We saw that in the Transvaal with South Africa, although not angels themselves. The Dutch Boer were rebelling against British rule and technical violations against British rule. And of course, the English were quite keen to put them down and were very eager to use the military. They also used concentration camps. It is not the domain of only the Germans, although, spoiler alert, in the future, as you are reading Anne's book, Anne's diary, you will see that they take it to a new level. But concentration camps are not the sole domain of the Third Reich. They actually happen in a lot of our vaunted democracies like France and the United Kingdom and the United States as well. So essentially, we have a map that is increasingly fractured. The Ottoman Empire had controlled a lot of territory into the Balkans, which is in the upper left, or actually entire left side of your screen here. Well, the Ottoman Empire was disintegrating and being eaten away both by internal politics and external pressure. It's a whole list of reasons. We've kind of already gone over that, so let's not retread that path. Essentially, what happened is these areas in the center that I've just circled with a yellow bubble are newly independent. And when I say newly independent, they've recently declared themselves sovereign from the Ottoman Empire within the last 50-ish years by the time we get to 1914. Now, some of these territories are acquired almost matter-of-factly by other empires. Of course, nature abhors a vacuum. Of course, colonialism knows no bounds. It's not just Africa, not just Asia, but also in Europe. And so you get Austria-Hungary that rolls into Bosnia and rolls into Croatia and takes over those territories. And they're looking to kind of add Serbia as well. Russia, by the same token, is also interested in Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and those areas as well, both to counter Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, but also as a way to access more directly the Mediterranean Sea. So as we see, Austria-Hungary becomes the new kind of dominant force in the Balkans, and they become a most resented force in the Balkans. Russia is fomenting anti-Austria-Hungarian propaganda. They're helping foster some terrorist organizations that we will talk about in a minute here, and all in an effort to destabilize Austria-Hungary's grip on this particular region. Now, this region we call the Balkans. In a nutshell, there are many powers that wanted the Balkans for their own reasons. The Ottoman Empire, which is looking to reestablish control over those areas. The Austria-Hungarian Empire, which is looking to establish new control, diminish the Ottoman Empire, and also cut off Russia. Russia looking to establish dominance as well, but also Italy's kind of playing around in this area as well, hoping to perhaps expand their territory at the expense of Austria-Hungary, at the expense of Russia, and at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. So we've got a lot of interests aligned in this one little area. There's propaganda, there's militarism, and there's backing of terrorist forces on all sides. What could possibly go wrong, right? Well, so we have our steps towards the Great War. Step 1, make sure you have competing European powers that want the exact same thing. Step 2, make sure you celebrate military might as the ultimate expression of national pride. We can blow you back into the Stone Age, and we bestride the globe like a colossus, and nobody can stand in our might. You also need to dehumanize the opponent, because if the other person is your neighbor, if the other person looks like you, talks like you, sounds like you, maybe could be you, but for the grace of God where you were born or live, well, you have to somehow differentiate them. And this is a kind of permutation of the divide and rule. So now we noble people living in our wonderful, amazing apex of civilization country must acquire this new land because those people living in those other lands are subhuman. They don't understand civilization. Oh, and the people who are opposing us, well, they're not even human to begin with. They are stupid, they're brutish, they're violent, they're inherently untrustworthy. And we'll see how that plays out. So we've got these 3 steps. So I want to look at some propaganda posters. All right, so here's the first one. This one is a Russian propaganda poster that was printed and disseminated throughout the Balkans in the Black Sea. And it depicts a knight on horseback fighting the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans and the Ottomans. Now, does it show the Austro-Hungarians, the Germans, and the Ottomans as similar knights on similar horseback, engaging in chivalrous combat, a contest truly between 2 equal forces, some noble quest, maybe a joust, something in which you can respect your opponent? No. They depict the opponents as hydras, as these mythical, rapacious, evil beings that are busy burning the city, as you see in the bottom part of the picture. And behind the knight is the glorious rays of God, and the shield is the Tsarist symbol, the wonderful, benevolent, protective Tsar of Russia. And the sword, of course, is the military. And they're slaying these hydras, these evil creatures that are not even human, but have humanoid features. Or perhaps we could talk about the Austro-Hungarians and their propaganda posters in the Balkans as well, as they see themselves as opposing Russia. They show themselves, of course, as knights on horseback, something noble, something to be aspired to, shining armor, a noble steed, a great cause. And of course, they're fighting their opponent, the person on horseback, who's also has a noble steed and shining armor and a great cause behind them, except they're not. They're fighting a dragon which in Christian Western mythology is equated with the devil, with Satan, and slaying it, much like Saint George if you're Anglican, or Saint Michael if you are Catholic. So how do we perceive these others, this other force across the border, not as humans, but as a horde of evil, the embodiment of all that is wrong in the world? Can both these images be correct? Can you have Russia that is fighting Austria-Hungary, and Austria-Hungary is dehuman, is demonic, is monstrous? And can you have Austria-Hungary who is fighting against a monstrous, dehuman, demonic Russia? It's kind of different, isn't it? I mean, you can't have these two messages. These messages are diametrically opposed. But to their points of view, they are casting themselves as the one truth in the world. Now, others, of course, appeal to nationalism, local nationalism. There was an attempt to rally Muslims living in the Balkans who had been living there for hundreds of years, if not 1,000 years by this time, who are still somewhat loyal, or at least still somewhat sympathetic towards the Turkish cause, rallying them. And so this appeal to nationalism, especially in Serbia. So all three of these leaflets dropping in Serbia, and you've got this recipe for disaster, just kind of a powder keg waiting for a spark. Now let's talk about some nomenclature before we move on. Now, the major powers in Europe make secret and semi-secret and public alliances back and forth. Over the past several years, between about 1908 and 1914, there is a series of interlocking alliances. Now, to make things simple and to make them consistent from the First World War to the Second World War, we're going to use some rather neutral terms. Now, the groups in red, England, France, and Russia, are, for our part, the Allies. Now, Italy is, although shown in green, not really kind of green. So let's do half green, half red at this point, because they kind of sort of belong to the Allies. So we've got the outside Allies, and then we have the Central Powers, which is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and yes, Italy. Later on, Turkey, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, joins the Central Powers, and they become part of the dehumanized evil that we have to fight against if we're the Allies. So essentially we have the Central Powers, just think of them as in the center of Europe, with Italy kind of sort of being on board of both sides, straddling the line, and then including Turkey as well. And then we have the Allies, which are in red on the outside, which kind of also includes which also includes Italy as well. So we've got these interlocking alliances. We've got a rising military presence, a kind of fetishizing of the military, and increasingly belligerent designs on the Balkans. Into that, we have an heir to the throne for the Austro-Hungarian Empire coming to visit Serbia. It's a state visit. It's seen in some circles as kind of an honor of the big neighbor coming to visit the small neighbor. We're increasing the bonds of friendship between the two. And in other circles, it's seen as a prelude to invasion, Whether this was true or not, there's probably a little bit of truth on both sides. So Archduke Franz Ferdinand, he is a young man who is just married. His wife is pregnant. He and his wife go and visit Serbia. He's a reformer. He's, as I mentioned before, the heir to the throne, but he's very sympathetic to nationalist ambitions. He wants to kind of ratchet down this whole talk about acquiring Serbia as a territory. So he's visiting Sarajevo, which is near Serbia. He's about to head on to Serbia for an official meeting when he is murdered. Who is he murdered by? A faceless terrorist, of course, right? Obviously, somebody hiding out in a cave, somebody who is subhuman, somebody who is insane and a coward, and all of those other negative words. Well, here he is on the right, a man named Gavrilo Princeps. He was a young man, 19 years old. He had been radicalized in his teenage years by those who told him that his nation needed to be sovereign from other nations, that his nation needed to be protected, and that it was just a matter of time before these big evil enemies descend upon Serbia and take his nation away from him and turn him and his fellows into basically de facto slaves, the way they had done in India, the way that they had done in South Africa, the way they had done in the Congo, in Algeria, in Indochina, what would later be known as Vietnam, that they had done in China, that they had attempted to do in several other places. Well, he was a nationalist. He was very proud of his nation, and he was indeed the murderer, although he was incredibly lucky. He and his fellow conspirators from an organization, the oh so innocuously named Black Hand, attended a meet and greet between Archduke Franz Ferdinand and a review of local police officers in Sarajevo. They threw a grenade. The grenade went off. It injured and killed a bunch of police officers, but the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was unscathed. He and his friends, realizing that the jig was up and the police were going to go get them, scatter. One of Gavrilo Princip's friends, or one of his co-conspirators, jumped off of a bridge, hoping to land in the river below, but because of a recent drought, the river was extremely low and only about a foot and a half of water. So when he lands in the bottom, he breaks both of his legs and gets stuck in the mud. Gavrilo Princeps himself gets away, gun in his pocket, sulking, feels like he's kind of made it away from the police, and decides to sit at a local cafe on the street corner and think out his next steps about how he had failed his nation. Meanwhile, back at Archduke Franz Ferdinand is aghast at this terrorist act that had killed noble and brave police officers, and he wanted to visit those police officers to thank them for their sacrifice and for their willingness to put their bodies between him and the exploding grenade. And so he wanted to find the hospital, but because they don't have MapQuest and because they don't have, well, very many maps really, or they're in a foreign country and they don't really know how to get there, his driver gets lost. And his driver was asking directions from a local and was trying to turn around in some very tight streets when he should pass in front of a cafe at which a young man was sitting. A very same young man who had thought, oh, I finally got away from the police, but I have failed in my mission. And there, delivered as if by providence, was the very target, with but a driver, a civilian, and his target, and then the target's wife in the back seat. The first shot rings out and strikes the wife in the stomach, killing her unborn baby and severing her spine. Franz Ferdinand, aghast, turns to his wife to try to help her because she's wounded, and several more shots go off and kill him and the driver as well. So Gavrilo Princeps, seeing that he had slain the heir of the Archduke, I'm sorry, if he had slain the heir of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had felt that he maybe had secured the future of his nation for all time and sent a message that would reverberate back to the powers that be to leave Serbia alone. Only it didn't work that way. Angered by the death of a kind of thorn in the side heir, the ruler of the Austro-Hungarian Empire decides that it's time to go to war. And he calls upon Germany. And Germany says, well, try to talk it out, work it out, but if it comes down to war, we've got your back. So Austria-Hungary hears, we've got your back, go to war. The Austro-Hungarians declare war on Serbia. Serbia says, hey, Russia, can you help us? Russia says, sure, we'd love to help you. Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary says, hey, Germany, will you help us out? Germany says, well, I guess so. Declares war on Russia. France, who had been in an alliance against Germany with Russia, says, oh, well, if Germany is going to war against Russia, I'm going to join in. So France joins in. So Germany and Austria-Hungary declare war against France. France has a interlocking alliance with England. England goes, gosh darn it, I guess we're in the war. Now we've got the whole world going to war. And an important part of war is getting people enthusiastic about going to war, about motivating them. We talked about Tom Paine and trying to motivate people to join the Revolutionary War. There wasn't a lot of appetite beforehand. Same thing is happening in Germany. Germany sees themselves as the noble eagles, guarding Europe over the rapacious and inhuman and frankly disgusting multi-legged creature that is a spider, because there's a giant spider that's about to descend on Europe. And that giant spider is, of course, England. England and its Union Jack abdomen are as poisonous as any gigantic spider. But for their own part, the French saw the war differently. The French saw the Kaiser Wilhelm as just being willing to consume the world for his national ambitions. And of course, the United States, when it eventually gets involved in the war, is not innocent in painting a rather skewed picture, showing the Germans not as Germans, but as Huns, as raiding, rapacious conquerors that are looking to destroy not just Europe, but looking out across a ruined Europe, across the ocean, to pristine, ripe for the picking United States. Essentially, the war, and we're going to talk mostly about the Western Front, because that's perhaps the most famous front. The Germans initially were very, very successful in penetrating deep into the Netherlands, into Belgium, and into France. But eventually, it bogs down. Eventually, the military of France and England proved to be an equal match to the German offensive. And likewise, the German and a little bit Austro-Hungarians turned out to be an equal match for the combined Russian and English troops. And so things get very nasty very quickly. And they settle into what's known as trench warfare. In other words, these long, sometimes very well manufactured trenches, basically, that keep you below ground level so that you can't get directly shot at by rifle bullets or by machine gun bullets. On the Eastern Front, Russia is standing alone against Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans, and they also bogged down into a stalemate fairly quickly. Not as successful as the Germans in the Western Front. The Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans still inflict some heavy losses on the Russians initially, but then it very quickly bogs down and it becomes quite the grinding stalemate. So war begins to consume the lives of people, not just killing people, but it becomes the daily reality in Europe. One of the daily realities is the mechanization of war. I talked initially about submarines. They were used very effectively by the German Navy. They were able to disrupt your imperial shipping for France and for England. They were able to even target so-called neutrals like the United States with relative impunity. Aerial warfare started off initially as scouting missions, but it very quickly became a way to drop bombs on the enemy. And of course, you had to defend yourself, so you threw airplanes up to shoot down other people's airplanes, and so you get some aerial warfare. You also see the machine gun um make its full release. Now it's out of beta, and it's ready to drop down on a wide release. The machine gun, the Maxim machine gun pictured here, can fire 600 rounds in a minute. That is 10 rounds every second, which is an astounding amount of bullets to put down range. Um, and of course, as you see here, the gentlemen that are manning the machine gun are wearing early prototypical gas masks. That's because chemical warfare it makes its rears its ugly head in the First World War. And there we have an idea of what the battlefield would have looked like in submarine warfare. And finally, towards the end, in order to overcome this trench warfare stalemate, tanks were invented. And of course, the counters to tanks, things like tank traps and rocket propelled grenades and anti tank weapons. But the most devastating, I think, the most horrifying, I think, is chemical warfare. Chemical warfare doesn't care where you are, doesn't care who you are, doesn't care whether you're careful or not careful, doesn't care whether you are innocent, whether you wanted to be there or not, or whether you're guilty, didn't care. It just mattered that you breathed. Now, gas warfare was initially billed as a humane way to end the war, that it would be so horrific that the other side would have no choice but to surrender. Now, initially, Germans were the ones who created these chemical warfares to kind of to create these initial chemical agents, but it was very quickly copied by French and English chemists as well, who saw this as a way to one up an arms race within the war, if you will, between the Central Powers and the Allies. Now, the idea was that these chemicals initially started off innocuous enough. They were irritants meant to drive people out of the trenches so they could be shot by machine guns or by rifle bullets or snipers or whatever. But then that became not quite as useful. Those proto gas masks deployed on the field, and then the chemicals had to become more powerful. They became suffocants, ones that would essentially remove a lot of the oxygen from the air and leave in its place these kind of miasmic gases. And that, of course, could force people out of the trenches where they could be nobly shot, where they would die nobly for their country. But then gas masks got better and protection got better. So then you had to go from suffocation to causing damage to people, making them caustic, acidic, as it were, and cause boils and lesions and pain as if you were on fire. And that, of course, would then cause the people to run out of the trenches where they could be nobly shot by bullets. And so a reality on the battlefield became a nightmare for most soldiers. Perhaps the most moving and stirring is a poem by a soldier himself, Wilfred Owen, who would not survive the war. And it's titled Dulce et Decorum Est. Anybody in the audience might know a little bit of Latin. It is essentially distilling it down into English. It is beautiful and fitting. That's what the name is. It is beautiful and fitting. And here he tells the story of a typical gas attack. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunted flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod. All went lame, all blind. Drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas, gas, quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes in thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dream you too could pace behind the wagon we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gurgling forth from froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is beautiful and fitting to die for your country. And as we see here on the pictures that I show you, these are people who survived their gas attacks, having their faces melted off or their hands melted away, fitted with prosthetic masks so they wouldn't horrify the people when they came home. Both sides, over the course of the years, become bogged down, and acquisition of territory is measured in yards and not miles. It was a stalemate. Gains were equal to losses. The death toll was staggering. At the Battle of the Somme, perhaps one of the most famous battles of World War I in November of 1916, about 1.2 million people were killed in 4 months, less than 4 months. And for all of that, for those 1.2 million people, the Allies gained 10 kilometers, about 6 miles. Not much. Women back in the home front were not immune to the realities of war. Many working class women who had been working regardless before the war found themselves employed in new and interesting jobs. And by interesting, I also mean dangerous, especially the creation of munitions. The so-called yellow girls. They were called yellow girls because they worked with sulfuric acid as part of the creation of munitions, as you see here, and it would turn their skin a very sickly yellow pale color. And in many cases, women working in munitions factories took their lives in their hands. All it took was one stray spark, whether static electricity or maybe a dropped metal tool upon a metal surface, would create a spark that would detonate the entire factory and devastate the entire complex. Working class women also worked in laundry, essentially laundering soldiers' gear to be sent back to the front because you had to keep them in clean gear. On top of it, many of these women who were married, or maybe they had fathers or brothers or cousins who were fighting in the war, received war bonuses for as long as their men were off fighting. They receive a little bit of extra money in order to make up for their loss, and many of these families become extremely dependent on war bonuses. So there's a economic incentive to force men to go to war. Middle class women find a new lease on life. We talked about settlement houses before. Those are very dangerous and kind of scandalous ways in which to assert your uniqueness, to assert your individuality as a middle class woman. Luckily, the war comes along And many of these middle class women find themselves able to go out and work in the workforce in things like women's auxiliary in the military, or in nursing, or in communications, bus driving, bank telling, you name it, as a patriotic move. It was difficult to dissuade women when they were invoking this idea of patriotism. The home front was incredibly important. Women and men alike were who were not in direct combat were seen as necessary to the furthering of the war. While all this horror is happening, there is a deprivation at home. There's rationing of everything from food to fuel to clothing, travel, you name it. Everything, every aspect of your life is controlled. And also, the home front is a source for recruitment. As young men become eligible for war age, as the need for military increases, men who hadn't volunteered before are increasingly pressured, all in order to feed the machine. And in this case, the machine is the war machine. Cities are increasingly targeted by belligerents, partly because of their strategic importance. Capturing a city is capturing a nexus for that infrastructure that may or may not survive. But also it disrupts enemy production. And when you force your way into a city, you choke the enemy's roads with refugees. So if you're invading, let's say from the north, of course, if you're a civilian, you're going to want to go south, away from where all the bad guys are coming in, basically. And so when you go south, well, where are your allies, or where are your soldiers coming from? Probably from the south or south-ish. You clog the roads and essentially bog down the enemy. And this works on both sides. Both the Allies and the Central Powers do this. All told, during World War I, there were 2.2 million civilian deaths, either through direct action, like bombing of factories or bombing of cities, through indirect ancillary collateral damage. For example, that gas warfare didn't stay on the battlefield. It would drift downwind and settle in lower areas like valleys where typically villages and towns and houses were down in the valley. And so that would cause civilian deaths in staggering amounts of numbers. The reality of what was happening back home, the deprivation of what was happening back home, the devastation of civilians, and the horrors of the front line cause widespread disaffection with not just the war, but with the status quo. At the home front, back with all that deprivation, all that rationing, all that restriction of movement, you name it, there were riots, particularly for food. This happens in Russia. There's a riot in Russia in 1914 and 1915 over the lack of food and fuel, a lot of which was being taken from civilians to pay to feed and to warm the soldiers on the front, who were also ill-equipped, but also because of the casualties, the staggering numbers of dead that were coming back, the staggering numbers of people who were permanently maimed were coming back. The economies of all belligerents are crumbling. By the time we get to about 1916, 1917, the economies are nearly bankrupt. A lot of nations like the UK are leaning on foreign loans, particularly from the United States. United States bankers are immune largely from the ravages of war, more than willing to lend out money to a lesser degree to Germany, slightly more degree to France, way more to the United Kingdom. And so you've got a problem of being able to pay your soldiers. So not only are you asking them to go into basically a meat grinder that is the front, but also you're not able to provide for their families, but also you're not able to pay them adequately. So what motivation do I have to go up to the front? And that is the very question that a lot of soldiers ask themselves. There are several mutinies that happen in 1916 and beyond. 50,000 French soldiers just straight up refuse to go to the front, saying you can't arrest all of us. You can't try all of us. You can't execute all of us. That we're 50,000 people. And the French army has to make concessions. Later on down the road, they do start punishing them here and there when they're isolated and not unified. About 600,000 Russian troops either desert their post, just straight up walk away and go walk back into the wilderness, find their way home, or they rise up in hit and miss mutinies, whether on um, naval ships or on the front line. The deprivations and the realities of war have gotten to them. And this kicks off a revolution in Russia in 1917. It destabilizes the government of the Tsar, and eventually leads to the toppling of Russia as an empire. And something that's not really even talked about very much is that at home, on the home front, in England, 20,000 troops took over a military base in the northern part of England and refused to go to war, refused to fight on the front. They continued to keep their military rank. They continued to march and drill and practice, but they said that they were not going to go to the front. And what could England do? You can't arrest and kill 20,000 people for desertion en masse. One or two, or even a dozen, sure, easy, no problem. We can find lots of people to do that. But if you have thousands, tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people who are deciding they're not going to fight anymore, what do you do? Well, Germany also is dealing with riots as well. They're dealing with food deprivation. There's an increasingly malnourished population because their fight is basically on their farmland. The fight's happening where a lot of the food would normally be grown, and they don't have a foreign empire to be able to draw food in from the way that others do. Germany appeals to the United States and talks about the German assistance in the Revolutionary War, how it was a German general who helped train the revolutionary soldiers to fight under George Washington more effectively against the British. Oh, and don't we have a lot of Germans living over there in the United States? Let's totally forget about the idea that the Hessians that were hired as mercenaries by the British, they were just mercenaries. Those aren't real Germans, that kind of thing. But the Germans also had a contingency plan. The Germans sent a secret telegram that was intercepted to the Mexican government, saying that if the United States enters into war against Germany, then Germany would give support to Mexico if Mexico decides that it would open up a front on the southern border of the United States. This was intercepted and of course became a reason why the United States didn't back the Germans. Also the unrestricted submarine warfare that kept targeting American ships, that sort of thing, made it kind of difficult, made it an uphill climb for Germany to make that appeal. The British, however, on the other hand, the United Kingdom appealed to the special relationship that existed between the United States and the United Kingdom since the end of the War of 1812. And also, to be honest, where the money lies, where the power lies in the American government is with bankers. And the bankers had loaned money to the British to the British and Germans, but had favored the British somewhat 10 to 1, right around 10 to 1. So for every dollar they loaned to Germany, they loaned $10 to the United Kingdom. And so in order to recoup the most for their investment, there was a lot of pressure on the American government to back the United Kingdom. And so we reach towards the end of the war. Now there's chaos in Russia. Russia has two revolutions in 1917 caused by a variety of factors. The loss of troops were the highest in World War I. They were the highest amongst all of the allies. They were losing lots and lots of troops, partly due to poor equipment, partly due to poor nutrition, partly due to the horrific weather that could sometimes happen. So they didn't have enough fuel to keep their troops warm. Troops would die of exposure. They would freeze to death, basically. And of course, gas warfare. There were widespread food shortages throughout the countryside that drove people into the cities where they had less access to growing their own food. Had hoped that they would find relief. The Tsar's regime was rather callous in dealing with them. Instead of meeting that need of food with bread or with soup kitchens or something like that, they turned out the military, and the military was told to fire upon civilians. Well, the military decided, nope, we're not going to do that, and they turned against the Tsar by and large. There was also fuel shortages, as I mentioned before. The soldiers on the front were freezing to death, as were people at home. There wasn't enough wood or coal or whatever to keep the houses warm. So into this chaotic mix comes the Bolsheviks. Now the Bolsheviks were led by a man named Vladimir Lenin, and they objected to the initial provisional government that had unseated the Tsar and created this kind of quasi-constitutional monarchy representative republic. It would have kept Russia in the war. It would have kept everything the same and wouldn't have changed anything at all, except for the method of representation. We're a much more kinder, sympathetic government, but we're going to keep fighting, which ignores the root causes of the initial revolution that happened in early 1917. Now, to their credit, the Bolsheviks believed in a decentralized government to give the local governors or the local groups or the Soviets, as they were called, a autonomy. So you would have a local governor who would be able to meet the needs of his people. So if they needed more shoes and less, I don't know, hats or whatever like that, he could order more shoes for the people and not so many hats. Or if they needed more bread and less beer, or if they needed more petrol and less wood, that sort of thing. So the idea was that the Soviets would then get together in a representative council, and they would each Soviet would have an equal voice. So it's very democratic, at least in the initial part. So you have this leader who is elected by the people within the Soviet. So you get together with you and your friends, you vote for whoever should be the leader who's going to be most sympathetic to your cause. That leader can also then go off to the National Assembly and represent your Soviet's interests. And so that was why it was the Union of Soviet Socialists. And eventually the Bolsheviks' idea and the method of organization was so appealing. It was very fundamentally a democratic, but also a very libertarian kind of view that you'd be able to keep your guns, you wouldn't be disarmed. It was necessary to keep your guns not only to defend yourself but to defend your nation. That you were lower taxes, more responsive government, a much more direct democracy, that sort of thing. But the consolidation of power did not go easy for the Bolsheviks, and there was a Russian civil war between 1917 and 1923 that increasingly made the Soviets much more dictatorial. Vladimir Lenin begins to consolidate a lot more power because of the exigencies of the Civil War. He says, okay, well, we can't quite do this multilateral approach. We need a unified vision in order to win this civil war. Once the civil war is over, then we'll be okay, and we can go back to the way that we originally planned it. It doesn't quite work out that way, largely because of foreign influence, particularly the United States and Britain, who keeps trying to topple this Bolshevik government. So it becomes entrenched in that very dictatorial mold. Also, to be honest, power is very addictive, and so the powerful want to keep the power. So once you've instituted a dictatorial regime, it's very difficult to get somebody motivated to give up that dictatorial power voluntarily. Often it winds up either entrenching itself or resulting in another revolution. So now Russia is out of the war. Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire are largely defeated. The Ottoman Empire itself is going through a similar civil war. Austria-Hungary is fracturing. There's mutinies. So now we just have Germany against France, Britain, and the United States. So what happens now? Well, the Ottoman Empire was collapsed, as I mentioned before. Austria-Hungary collapses and surrenders in 1918. Russia withdraws in 1917, and American troops must bolster France and England. If the United States had not entered the war on the side of France and England, we would have had a much different settlement at the end of the war. I believe the war would have probably creaked on for a few more months before eventually both exhausted sides would have had to come to a more egalitarian settlement. As it is, though, the United States does get involved on the side of France and England, and that story really kind of kept the war alive for about another year. The United States fights for about 18 months in World War One and sees some of the worst effects of World War One firsthand. Now, Britain had been calling upon Indian troops to fight. We talked about India being part of the British Empire. Indian troops were largely thrown at the enemy. They were used as cannon fodder. They were integral to the fight, however. And it becomes a point of national pride for the Indians to say, we participated in World War One, we helped defend the empire. Now it's time to give us our rights. That doesn't quite manifest very well after World War One, and in fact, the United Kingdom institutes martial law in India and imprisons many members of the Indian National Congress who were critical of martial law, and that martial law continues all the way into World War Two. The Chinese, which had been divvied up by those European powers, you remember last time when I talked about India being divided, one of the dividers was Austria-Hungary, another of the dividers was Germany. Well, a lot of those territories were claimed by the Japanese and administered on behalf of the Allies by the Japanese. And a lot of the people who had been under the sphere of influence of the foreign powers in China came over to fight. Well, not really fight. They were not allowed to fight in the Western Front because, well, racism. Honestly, I mean, it boils down to that. They can't be trusted, basically, to fight. That they would flee at the first chance. Plus, if we teach them to fight, they're going to rebel against us. They're going to know Western fighting uh, uh, techniques and strategies and will be able to wrest control of their own country. So the Chinese workers did everything from digging ditches to moving crates to being medics, communications experts to mechanics, you name it. The United States also has a colonial history, although it's very much an internal colonial history, insofar as it deals with the Black experience all the way up to World War One. In the United States, Black troops had been segregated from white troops. It goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War. Famously, in the Civil War, there were Black troops that were led by white officers. In World War One, there were white upper officers, so captain and above, who led battalions of colored regiments that were led by Black officers, usually captain or below. And the majority of Black soldiers were not actually trained to fight with real weapons. They weren't given rifles, they were given broomsticks. They were um, not allowed to fight once they got over into the actual theater of war, and instead they were turned into porters, people who would carry luggage. These soldiers who had volunteered to fight for their country had answered the call to defend the United States, were given broomsticks to drill with, as if they would never actually be seeing the actual front. And when they did get over there, they actually didn't see the actual front for a very long time. Instead, they were used as general labor, basically the same job that they had before they joined the military. It was very degrading, very dehumanizing, very frustrating for many of these soldiers. But there was an opportunity. Now, French soldiers had borne the brunt of the casualties in the German offensives. And so a lot of the French troops were, especially battalions, were depleted. And so the French sent a request for troops to the Americans. The Americans go, you can have our black soldiers. We don't really need them anyway. So these black soldiers were brought over to fight under French battalions, under a loan. They were kind of like borrowed, basically. And when given weapons and given the opportunity, these black soldiers became the most decorated French soldiers had ever seen. They became these amazing fighters. They earned distinction. The French called them the men of bronze, bronze that can't be broken. It's not tarnished over time. They are held up as kind of the epitome of the warrior class, if you will. The United States is angered at the French lavishing praise upon these troops because comparatively the French were more used to integrating troops. Those African troops that France had African colonies, African troops had been integrated into French battalions early on in the war, and so there was a lot of experience and a lot of familiarity and comfort with having black soldiers fighting alongside white soldiers. The United States was not about that at all, was angered by the accolades that were heaped upon the black soldiers and demanded that white soldiers receive equal treatment and equal awards. So every award that a black soldier get, the United States said, if you don't give one of our white soldiers an equal or better award, we're going to withdraw those borrowed troops. Now, the Germans began to fear these American troops. They referred to them as the Hellfighters. And there's a book by author Max Brooks called The Harlem Hellfighters that kind of semi-biographically chronicles the experience of these black soldiers. And they have this amazing reputation in the German circles. They're widely respected and feared. With the French, they're seen as much more egalitarian. In fact, after the war, a lot of black soldiers, black veterans, will pack up their gear and they go back to the France after the war and live in France, where it's a lot more free, where they're a lot more democratic, where they're treated a little bit better, significantly better than in the United States. Japan, for its part, is critical in the Pacific end of the war effort because it is a world war. There is fighting in the Pacific, though not to the scale that we'll see in the 1940s. They captured German territory, as I mentioned before, in China and Micronesia. They act as basically enforcers for the Allied powers who can't put down a lot of rebellions that happen in Indonesia and Singapore. And they also become innovative in the war. They're the first nation in the world to launch an airplane from a ship. They're not the first to land on it because it's a seaplane. It is launched from basically a modified battleship or a modified destroyer, I think it is, that launches the airplane, and it's a reconnaissance airplane, and then the airplane would land next to the ship, and a crane would pick it up and put it back on the ship, basically. Japan contributes to the European theater. They send hospital ships, they send doctors, they send medical supplies, they send ammunition, you name it. So they're a full partner in many ways. They're just not seeing as much direct fighting as perhaps on the Western Front, because most of the fighting does happen in Europe. I'm going to skip over Africa here real quick. Eventually, however, as I mentioned before, something had to give. We've got all of this, all of these people, all of this relatively fresh troops on the side of the Allies, and the Central Powers are really kind of doomed. And Germany is alone as the final Central Power by the time we get to 1918. The British are blockading ports, and it's exacerbating the starvation of their citizens. In contravention of international agreements and the standards of war, the British don't allow any ship into German harbors, even humanitarian ships that carry vital medical supplies and food, things that would be humanitarian, not necessarily directly fighting the war. And it particularly fires upon neutral ships like Spanish ships and American ships in order to dissuade them from coming close to German ports, in contravention to what they're supposed to be fighting for. England and France are bolstered by the fresh Americans, and they flex that power over Germany. Um, the armistice is eventually signed to end open fighting, and the end of the war officially comes on November 11th, 1918. Now, France and the UK are essentially dominating the conversations in the negotiations at the Treaty of Versailles. The United States is treated as a junior partner, as is India and Japan. India, which had been agitating for a seat at the table, saying one of the reasons why the United States got into the war was to ensure democracy and self-determination. We would like to be at the table. Japan said, hey, we helped out with the war effort. We want a bigger slice of the pie. We want some territories over in Asia that we need for our national well-being. The United States is saying, hey, we don't want you to punish Germany. We want you to come to an agreement with each other. All of that is ignored, and instead the French and British negotiators settle upon this exorbitant, uh, harsh penalties upon Germany. Germany is saddled with the majority of the debt for the war. They have to pay these reparations. They're stifled in the recovery of their economy. They are forced to institute a very weak democratic institution that has a relatively weak executive, very devolved power. So you wouldn't have this unified imperial kind of Germany coming back. And while the rest of the world celebrates this armistice, this ending of the war, the official ending of the war in 1919, Woodrow Wilson comes home and he is lambasted in the United States as a weak leader, as ineffectual. He actually winds up getting sick. He has a stroke and he gets pneumonia, and that's mostly kept out of the press. But his presidency is doomed from there on out, and his legacy is doomed. And from the end of the war on the next election in 1920 all the way to 1932, the Republican Party dominates the presidential elections, largely harping on the weakness of the Democratic Party as personified by Woodrow Wilson. Um, the Germans also don't celebrate the end of this. In fact, uh, a German a German diplomat at the time said that you have not a peace but a 20-year ceasefire, essentially. So he's saying that it's going to take about 20 years and then Germany's going to be back and it's going to be pissed. And boy, was he right. Ferdinand Foch, one of the German negotiators, had actually quit the negotiations in disgust because not even reasonable accommodations, not even reasonable stipulations could be entered into the treaty, which was largely dominated by this overweening pride and hurt, a bruised ego of the French and the English. England and France are essentially broke, and they use this agreement to help try to replenish their coffers. England and France are not keen to give up the territories overseas as well. That's one of the reasons why India is turned away from the table. That's one of the reasons why Japan is turned away from the table. These claims on these territories, that jeopardizes the ability of these countries to reinvigorate their economies. And just as if you thought maybe the war wasn't bad enough, and just as if you thought perhaps I was being hyperbolic when I say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly likes to rhyme, we have an outbreak in 1918 of something called the Spanish flu. It's actually H1N1, also known as the swine flu. H1N1 is called the Spanish flu because, unlike other countries, neutral Spain, Spain which had not participated in World War I, had a much freer press, had a much more relaxed attitude towards reporting and towards uh, medical diagnoses and letting the world know what was going on. They were the first to really report a major celebrity who had gotten the H1N1 and was very, very sick with it. The King Alfonso XIII was perhaps the most famous celebrity of the time who had been infected with this H1N1 virus, but it did not originate in Spain. It's a pejorative, really. They're saying, oh, well, it originated in Spain because that's the first place that reported it. The reality is that the first real cases of H1N1 were actually reported in France and England before they were reported in Spain, but the respective governments of France and England didn't want the population to panic, so they downplayed these reports. They quashed a lot of these reports. They basically ignored it and pretended it wouldn't happen. The viral infection was unusual, however, in the way that it targeted people. It targeted children under 5 years old, which is typical because their immune system is still developing. That is true even today. It targeted people over 60 years old. Absolutely, this is true because typically over 60 years old, your immune system begins to kind of like break down, not be as effective. So targeting those, not surprising. What was surprising, however, was the number of people between age 20 and 40 who were affected and died from the H1N1 virus. It's believed in large part that these people were more likely to ignore the symptoms that they would get, that they were more likely to just discount it as yet another cold or yet another flu or something that I'll be able to fight my way through, which is entirely possible. But it doesn't explain the entirety of the deaths that affected 20 to 40-year-olds, the healthiest demographic in general. And it seems, by and large, that the carriers who um, spread the disease were actually returning soldiers, people who had been on the front lines. So there's an increasing theory, although it's very hard to pin down because the documentation is not very good, that the first instances of the H1N1 virus, which crop up towards the end of the war in 1917 and early 1918, it's a Western Front kind of infection that cropped up because of the war, because of the deprivations and stress and the conditions that were present on the war front. Now there was an effort to contain the virus because, just as now, back then there were no antivirals, and just as now, the virus opens up the possibility of somebody getting secondary infections, typically bacterial infections. So you can get the H1N1, it weakens your immune system, and then next thing you know, you get pneumonia, you get some other kind of other infection that just basically overwhelms your immune system, and you wind up dying from it. So initially, there was the prescription for combating this infection was to isolate people who were infected and to distance them, to keep them at least 2 meters apart, about 6.5 feet, 6.4-ish feet. The problem with this was that although it is not a bad policy to distance people who might be affected, who might be carriers of the disease, it was applied unevenly. So it was very hit and miss. Some places it was very successful. Some places kind of fudged the numbers. 2 meters, we mean less than 6 feet. Oh, well, we need more beds, so we mean maybe 4 feet, and we'll put a sheet between people, that sort of thing. So there were compromises that were made in order to answer the demands of this increasing, exponentially growing infection. Well, the second prescription was hygiene. hygiene, washing your hands with soap and water, destroys a lipid layer around a virus. It's one of the reasons why viruses do not do well on washed surfaces, particularly your hands. The lipid layer is a protective layer around the virus itself that when it's gone, when it denatures, when you wash with soap, it breaks down that oil. When that's gone, the virus is basically unravels and it disintegrates and it becomes useless. Also, that lipid layer is used to adhere to surfaces. So much like oil gets stuck on your fingers, like if you ever work on a car or if you ever cook in a kitchen, sometimes oil gets on your hands. It's really hard to get off. Best way to get it off is with soap. You use soap that breaks it down and it gets off. So then that all same thing is happening. The problem here is hygiene again was applied unevenly. People were not washing their hands. People were not washing infected surfaces well enough. People were not taking the appropriate precautions. If you ever read the old childhood story of the Velveteen Rabbit, you'll see why it was very important to sanitize things for people's use, because the Velveteen Rabbit is basically a disease carrier. It's not the rabbit's fault, but it's just the reality. So what was the third one? Well, there was a third prescription in 1918 of travel bans and lockdowns. Some cities, some states, some countries did inhibit people moving around to keep the virus contained, to lock down these areas. Did it affect the economy? Absolutely. We're talking, we just finished a war. Now we can't get back to work. We can't go meet face to face. Much more likely to have to meet face to face in 1918 than in 2020. So you can imagine how difficult it would have been to get things done in a not face to face kind of manner. Again, this was also applied very unevenly. Some countries, such as the United Kingdom, really did not implement these lockdowns very well. They had to get products to and from their colonies. They had to really ramp up their economy to recover from the war. And so sacrifices were made in the name of economy. Basically, they should have stayed home. They should have washed their hands and they should have kept a distance. By the way, being outside talking with your neighbor over a fence, if you are within 6 feet of each other, you're in the danger zone, even if you feel fine. So just letting you know, pay attention to that, pay attention to hit and miss, wash your hands, stay at home. Now there were 3 waves of infection, as I mentioned before, in late 1917. There was some outbreak of the H1N1 swine flu. It really hits in 1918, early in mid 1918, around June 29th or 30th, initially, and then it drops down. And that's largely because the field hospitals are doing very good job of isolating people because of the protocols that were put in place during the war, things like gas warfare. The chemicals could live on people's skin, in their clothing, that sort of thing. And so there was a lot of emphasis on hygiene, on isolating people, and on treating them as soon as possible. However, as the war ramps down, as there are fewer and fewer hospitals, less and less hygiene, as the end seems closer and closer and closer, you see in November 1918, it really peaks. So there's a second one. So there's a secondary infection. The secondary infection is spread largely back home as soldiers are discharged from the military, sent back home. They're not following the same regimens as they were in the military. They have a lot more freedom of moving around. They have a lot less emphasis on washing and hygiene and keeping clean and going and seeing a physician when they're sick, that kind of thing. And then there's a third peak in 1919. This comes well after the majority of the deaths had happened. A lot of people thought, well, once you've gotten the virus and you've survived it, you should be okay. That is kind of true. You're more resistant to the disease. It doesn't mean you're immune to the disease. You can get it again, and you can, at the very least, become a carrier for it and pass it to new people, newborns, the elderly, you name it. So all told, over the course of 2 years, about 5% of the global population dies from this pandemic. So do not think that just because the disease numbers aren't very high in the death toll for the Spanish flu, that it didn't have a profound effect. That's 1 in 20 people. 1 in 20 people. I'm sure you can think of 20 people in your life and imagine one of them dying because of this. That's the reality. And unfortunately, it seems like that is the reality again in our current state. So all of this horrific experiences on the battlefield, the depletion of national treasuries, the loss of life, the the outbreak of disease lead to um, a period or a group of people in the 1920s that are referred to often in American literature as the lost generation. And what do we mean by lost? Well, they seemed directionless. They didn't seem to care about the same things that the previous generations did. They seemed distant. They seemed disconnected. They seemed uh, as if the things that mattered before the war suddenly don't matter. And that's true. Between gas warfare, the horrors of World War I, an uneven burden upon poor people to fight the war, uneducated people to fight the war, the affluent people who were in charge of the country, who could afford to buy their children a way out of the war, were not affected. In fact, there were many people who, and we see this on the bottom of profiteering, there were many people who made lots of money on the war. War can be good. Tragedy can be good. Disease can be good. Markets tanking can be good. The people who make money off of that typically are the rich, the absolutely affluent who are able to see market trends and bet against the market, who quote unquote short stocks. They sell stocks early in the anticipation that they're going to drop precipitously and they make a lot of money. Then they come in and sweep up when you, me, and maybe our neighbor have lost our house or have lost our job or have lost our savings or our retirement, and they pick it up for pennies on the dollar and they're no worse for wear. The wounded war vets carry the war home, both physically, where they face discrimination for their disfigurement, whether it's they lost an arm, they lost a leg, lost an eye, they have a limp, whatever like that. There is a lot of discrimination against them. If anybody takes a moment to watch Downton Abbey, the valet, who is a very upstanding and honorable man, is mocked for his war injury that he had suffered in the Boer War. So, physical wounds and disfiguration are a way to discriminate against people. So, wounded vets have a hard time finding jobs. They have a hard time fitting in social circles. But there's also the emotional toll, the so-called what in World War I was referred to as shell shock, that the bombs going off had rattled their brains and somehow they were deficient. And so that was an emotional disfigurement that the society at large could not deal with. We refer to it now as post-traumatic stress disorder, and PTSD can affect a lot of people in a lot of different ways. There is no one PTSD. And I urge those of you who have family members who are in the military or who yourselves are military or know anybody who's in the military, especially if they have seen combat, to please, please, please get assistance, even if you think you don't need it. Sometimes it manifests in very strange ways, and PTSD can come out. And it's not just military either. There's police officers, there's violence survivors, that sort of thing. So if you have any of those, please, I urge you to look for help, because we live in an age where it's recognized and it can be treated. So essentially, this leads to a society that is largely disillusioned with the optimistic, progressive attitudes of the 19th century. It is no coincidence that the World War I's season end to this fascination of the progressivist movement, that the world will be better, that we can make it better. We begin to see the emergence of more dystopic writings, particularly written by World War I veterans, Aldous Huxley. Oh gosh, I can't remember the other one. Oh gosh. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm stuttering on. So Aldous Huxley is a very good one. Brave New World, where he talks about this dystopic future. Uh, um, George Orwell, 1984, where he talks about a dystopic future, a different dystopic future. There's a lot of the World War I imagery, which makes its way into the Lord of the Rings, because J.R.R. Tolkien had been in the trenches in World War One, and so there's a lot of pessimism about the future that emerges because of World War One, and that persists all the way through to World War Two, and reemerges throughout the 20th century. Technology doesn't save us, and the status quo basically is a lie, that we're the ones who bear the burden, and the rich people or the powerful people or the ones who actually start the war get away scot-free. So in summation, World War One is caused by a multitude of factors. Countries being and leaders being stupid, being overly confident, of people wanting more than they have, of seeing others as subhuman, and on and on and on. The post-war settlement was deeply, deeply unfair, and it paused the conflict and it didn't establish peace. The pandemic that emerges at the end of World War I victimizes the world, and the uneven, erratic leadership leads to wider spread deaths than should have been. PTSD for veterans, women, and civilians remains unrecognized and is met with large indifference by the society, as if you could just, quote, snap out of it, unquote. The root causes of all of these wars are never really addressed. The root causes of all of these troubles in the world are never really addressed. The root causes of revolution in Russia, things like poverty and malnutrition, those aren't really addressed. The root causes of the mutinies of the military, of unequal power, unequal income, of unequal burden are never really addressed, and they get kind of glossed over in the 1920s as the economies come back roaring throughout the 1920s. That's it for this week, guys. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you stay safe. Please, please, please stay safe, and hope to see you again next week.